Greetings, viewers, and welcome to today's info sharing snippet, where we're covering the transaction types concept within Sage Evolution. Now, transaction types form a vital part in any evolution database. Transaction types are linked to GL accounts, and these transaction types determine exactly which GL accounts are impacted when a transaction is processed. Now, when creating an evolution database, you're able to specify your GL structure, either a segmented structure or non-segmented structure. If you decide on a non-segmented structure, you can determine if you'd like to make use of a character or numeric chart of accounts. And these accounts are then created when the database is set up. So if we then look at our general ledger structure under maintenance accounts, we have our range of GL accounts, and these accounts would then be linked to your transaction types. So today we'll be focusing on the core transaction types under customers, suppliers, and those transaction types related to inventory transactions. If we then move over to our customers and under maintenance, we've got the option to set up our transaction types. When creating a new database, transaction types are created by default and populated with a GL account specified in your GL accounting structure. So if we look at the range of transaction types applicable to customers, we've got, for example, an opening balance, a BF code, which really is the ability to process opening balances for your customers. We've got credit note transaction types, discounts, invoices, interest, general credits and debits, and if you are using foreign exchange transactions, a profit or loss on exchange transaction types. We also have details on, for example, the payment of customers, and then also information about point of sale transaction types that you might make use of. So if we, for example, just take an invoice in, for example, customers, and edit the transaction type, you'll see that you specify transaction code, description, and is it a debit or credit transaction type. And very importantly, on the right-hand side, we've got details about the relevant ledger accounts, which will be updated when the transaction is processed. In this instance, it's a debit transaction type. It's going to update or debit the receivables control account and credit the sales account. And then also the ability to prompt for ledger account and also to split the ledger account, which we'll come to later in the presentation. And also the ability to link to other transaction types. So a good example of that, for example, if I look at my payment, when making or processing a payment from a customer, we can then link that transaction type to a discount. So a settlement discount that you may offer your customers to pay their account with a specified time frame. Right, so we've got our customer transaction types. If we then move over to our suppliers, we also have a range of transaction types and very similar to the ones we have on our customers. Obviously, slightly different with regards to credits and debits. So for example, if you look at the invoice for a customer or supplier, you notice that in this particular instance, it is a credit transaction type with details about the credit ledger account, debit ledger account, and the debit tax account in this case. If we move over to our inventory transaction types, there's a variety of transaction types specifically to inventory transactions. So starting off with things like adjustments, which would be adjustments to, for example, the stock quantities, adjustments to cost prices, information about bill of materials manufacturing. So if you are using a bill of material, there's a transaction type for the manufacture of the bill, updating of the bill costs, etc. And also taking it further on the manufacturing side, transaction types for manufacturing of byproducts, the drawing of raw materials for manufacture process, the actual manufacture process, and manufacturing variances, and instances where there could be a wastage factor in manufacturing. We've also catered for those particular transaction types. There's also information about, for example, adjustments on the retail side of processing retail point-of-sale transactions. And then also regards to the transferring of goods from one warehouse to another via warehouse transfer. We also have, for example, on the supplier side, the GRV being the receiving of goods from suppliers, and then also returning to supplier, and also the supply invoice transaction types. And finally, we've got details about the processing of invoices. So these would be, for example, customer invoices, the issuing of stock, and the credit notes on credit note transactions. So as you can see, a wide variety of transactions pertaining to stock on transaction types. So if, for example, we go to our invoicing, so these would really be the processing of inventory invoices in the inventory module. Let's take a look at this particular transaction type. So here we've got a transaction type which is linked to the issuing of stock transaction type. So when the goods are being sold, the stock is being issued, and we specified the relevant debit ledger account, credit ledger account, etc. Now, one of the issues or one of the features we have is ability to always prompt for a credit ledger account. So I'm going to use that option. And in this particular instance, by default, we've set up that the debit ledger account will be your customer's control account, credit ledger account being the sales account. So we are able, when processing a transaction, to have a prompt where we can specify a different sales account. So, for example, you may have multiple sales accounts, and you maybe want to, for example, specify a different sales account on the invoice transaction. Right, let's just see exactly how that functions with regards to processing invoices. So I'm going to just say update this particular transaction code. And under transactions, under inventory, I'm going to go to invoices. I've got my invoice screen opening. I'm going to then specify a particular customer, and it's going to be an invoice for stock items. And I'm now going to specify the items to be sold. Right, so there we go. I've got my details. And once again, you specify the items of the transaction. Right, so I've got my details. So currently now we're saying that based on the invoicing transaction type, that it's going to update the customer's control account and the sales account. So I'm going to process the transaction. And what you'll notice now is that I've got the ability to use a prompt. So at this particular point, these are my default accounts. However, I can, for example, say I'd want to maybe update a different sales account. So there we go. And I'm going to update the sales sundry account for this particular transaction simply because I've enabled the prompt on my particular transaction type. And I can process the transaction and update the invoice. Now, if we take it a step further and we go revert back to our transaction types, we also have the ability under any transaction type to use the split option. So I can say, for example, always split for credit ledger account, whereby I can take a specific line item and split those transactions even further. So I'm going to enable the split ledger account option and then revert back to my invoices. And specify my customer. Right, so there we go. And I'm once again going to specify the items to be sold. Right, at this particular point, I can now update the transaction and say process. Notice is let's just change the cost of the item here. Process the transaction. And what we have here is the ability to prompt and split this particular transaction. So I'm going to use the split option. And it tells me exactly what the total of the transaction is. and I now need to allocate or split this particular value between different deal accounts. So firstly, I'm going to go find my relevant sales accounts. And once again, I can go and specify different sales accounts. So I've set up multiple sales accounts. I'm going to go to my sales consumables. And specify the amount to be split to that particular account. So I'm going to say, for example, maybe, and I'm then going to go use the and gives me a breakdown of exactly the allocated amount, the amount to allocate, and the transaction amount. So I'm now going to allocate the final amount, which is the 118. And if I just tab off the line, you'll see that I've allocated the full amount under those particular or those three sales accounts. Initially, the transaction type was referring to my sales account only, but I've been able to allocate this particular invoice to those three different sales accounts. I'm going to say OK there and update and print the invoice if necessary. Right, so those are my transaction types. And if we then revert back to the transaction type setup, all of those transaction types we can then go and edit, and we can always use the split on the prompt option if required. And then once again, once your database has been created, you could then simply import your chart of accounts via the data distribution services, and then edit these particular transaction types and insert your own GL accounts as required. You can certainly go create your own transaction types, which may be specific to your database, and then populate them with the relevant GL accounts. If we then just go back to our bill of materials module, and if we look at the transaction types under our defaults, so under my defaults, I've got the transactions, and once again, at this particular point, I'm able to specify the different transaction types for those manufacturing actions. For example, the drawing and returning of goods, the manufacture, unmanufacture, the wastage, creating of byproducts, any variances that you may encounter, the updating of costs, and a bill breakup. So I can simply go and populate the particular transaction codes here with my transaction types, which I set up previously. Now, very importantly is that we know that in each module, there are specific defaults that need to be updated or set up before transacting can take place. And if we go through to, for example, our inventory, and I'm going to go through to my defaults. And for example, under inventory, you'll see that we've got some information there, but under invoicing, it just tells us that when processing invoices, we're going to now use the INV transaction code, and we can then obviously deduce from there which accounts are going to be updated on the particular invoice when it's processed. Things like, for example, credit notes, once again, we've linked the transaction code CRN there. Goods received vouchers. In this instance, we've set up the GRV code together with any or the details for the supplier invoice transaction code. Returns to suppliers, specifying an RTS transaction type. And then adjustments would be things like, for example, the adjusting of stock quantities, as well as the adjusting of cost prices on specific inventory items. Right, so as you can see, very important that we set up those transaction types correctly with the correct GL accounts linked to them. And once that has been set up, go to our defaults in specific modules and then go and link those particular entries to the relevant transaction types. If we then just go back, for example, to our customers and sales, and we go to the defaults option there, the important transaction type there is our foreign currency, where we're specifying the loss or profit on exchange on those particular foreign currency transactions. And we can simply then go and specify the relevant transaction codes for those setups. So the whole important factor here is that once you've got your database set up, review your transaction codes, ensure that the relevant or correct GL accounts are linked to those transaction codes to ensure that when processing transactions, the correct GL accounts are impacted. And also very important to ensure that under relevant defaults for the various modules that the correct transaction codes have been set up. Thank you for tuning into this presentation. It's over and out from me, and goodbye.